In this video, we're going to go over the setup and operation of DryerMaster's Moisture Monitor Pro system. We're going to start by assuming that everything is all wired up and the sensor or sensors have been wired into the unit. The Moisture Monitor Pro, as you know, can use either one or two moisture sensors, and it automatically self-configures for whichever option you've gone with. So first we'll start by turning on the unit. There's an on-off button at the bottom of the cabinet. And the first thing that'll happen is we'll load the software. Now when you come up for the first time, assuming there's no product at the sensor, what you'll see is an empty reading, and you'll also see a temperature reading from the moisture sensor, and that temperature will be basically whatever ambient temperature is around the sensor. And also on the screen you'll see the grains that you've been set up for. So in this case we've got sensor 1, the top one, set up for canola, and sensor 2, the second one, set up for corn. Now the first thing we're going to do is we're going to assume that there's some product going past the sensor, and we're just going to get some moisture. Okay, so now we've got product at the sensor. Now we're going to go through some of the basic setup. So the first thing we're going to look at is, let's say we want to change the product, because the way Moisture Monitor Pro is set up, every product has its own set of settings and every sensor has its own set of settings. So we're going to go through some of the basic ones. It's really pretty straightforward. So we hit the menu key. And from the menu key you get the extended menu. And obviously the first thing we're going to do is we're going to change product. And we're going to change that first product, which is canola, we're going to change that to corn. So we hit sensor 1, and it says select product 1. So we have canola. And to change, we just hit the change button. And if one of the products you're measuring moisture of is not in the list, we have a couple of options here for other 1, other 2, other 3. But in this case, we're going to leave it at corn. So you see here we're back now to having corn as the product in product 1. Okay, so we got the product set up. The first thing we're going to look at is the alarm system. Now, alarming in the Moisture Monitor Pro there's an informational device, so it'll sound an alarm if the moisture is out of the range you're expecting. And so we're going to go through basically how to set the alarms, what alarms there are, and then we'll watch an example of what happens. So there's a button there for set alarms, and we're going to do it for corn. Like I said, each product has its own set of alarms. And we just press enter, and then we have corn moisture and corn temperature. We're just going to do the moisture ones now just to show us an example. So again, it's a touch screen, so we just touch, and then we have 4 settings for each sensor. So we have CHS1, which is critical high sensor 1. CHS2 is critical high sensor 2. WH, warning high sensor 1. And then if we go down, we have warning low sensor 1, WL. And then CLS1 is critical low sensor 1. Now, there's no real difference between anything that happens when you use either critical or a warning. It's just how the information is displayed on the screen that's a difference. So in our case, what we're going to do is we're going to look at critical high sensor 1. We're going to change that from 20, and we'll just change that to 22. Okay, and if we go back to the main screen, we're going to see what happens if you go into an alarm. So we just keep hitting the escape key, and we get back there. Now we're going to get the moisture. Something happens, and something. This is going to be a critical alarm because we're over 22. And there's a delay before the alarm goes on. Essentially, so you don't have nuisance alarms, so something weird happens just for a second or two. So there's an alarm delay. I'm going to show you in a second how to set that up. The default is 10 seconds. And if there's an active alarm, you can acknowledge it by hitting the active alarm button. It'll list you the active alarms. So we've got a warning high and a critical high, obviously, because it's over the warning and the critical limit. If you want to see a log of alarms, just press that. And while it's still an alarm, if it's into a critical level, it'll flash. If it's a warning level, it'll just be a solid number. Okay, so if we take it to this, we should have a warning alarm after 10 seconds. There we go. If I clear it, again I see it, and then I am in a warning situation. Now, I said there was an alarm delay, so that 10 seconds we saw, we can set that easily. So we're going to go now into the kind of the more detailed engineering screens. So we just hit the System Setup button, the password, 6853, enter, and this is under alarm settings, so we can use the little up and down arrows, and enter. And we've got an alarm delay here for sensor 1 and for sensor 2. The 10 is to 10 seconds, so it has to be an alarm for 10 seconds before the alarm goes off. And there's also a remote alarm, so if you want to set up an alarm, say out at another part of the site where you're going to wire it up and there's going to be a sound going off if it's an alarm, you can do that as well. And the remote alarm is already set up to be on if it's plugged in. And then you can also set a remote alarm delay there as well. That's the one down here. Okay, so that's essentially what we have to do with alarms. So now we're back on the main screen. And the other thing you're going to want to do with your system is we're going to go through a calibration routine for calibrating the moisture sensor. And there's two different ways of doing it. One is a standard way and one is an advanced way. We're going to start giving you an example of the standard way. So let's look at sensor 1. The moisture now is 15.4. Let's assume you just went and did a moisture test and the result was 15.6. And you want to adjust the dryer master to read 15.6. So what we would do is you hit the calibration screen. We pick sensor 1 and there's 15.4. We just do it like this. Now we're at 15.6. We go save, calibration complete, and now the dryer master reads at 15.6. So that's a very quick way of doing a calibration. The other way is we call the advanced way, and you may use a calibration button, or we can use a virtual calibration button from the screen, which is what I'm going to show you next. So the first thing we want to do is change the option from standard to advanced. So we go menu, system setup, password, and we're going to go into calibration settings. And right now it's a standard setting, so we're going to want to change that. Again, the way we do it is up arrow keys, there's advanced, we enter, now we've changed it to advanced. And there's other one here which is the factor 0 to 1 of sensor 1, and we set at 0.5. What that means is basically when you do a calibration in the advanced mode, it'll only adjust half the difference between the dryer master reading and your manual sample. And the reason for that is there's always variation even when you're doing a manual sample. So let's say you take enough product for running 3 tests on a sample. The chances of all 3 tests from that sample being the same are pretty low. There's going to be a range of values. So to avoid making too much of an adjustment at one time, what we recommend is making a half of the adjustment. And so that's what the 0.5 is. If you want to make 3/4 of the adjustment, you can change that factor to 0.75. So whatever you want to do, you can change it there. The default is 0.5, but we'll go through an example. Okay, so we're going to calibrate sensor 1. Sensor 1. Now we don't have a calibration button right here, so we're going to use the virtual one here. So we start. And now what's supposed to happen is you go out and you take a sample. And the idea is that you take a sample over 30 seconds. And the Moisture Monitor Pro will also collect information for the next 30 seconds while the calibration button is flashing. At the end of that 30 seconds, it'll calculate an average of what its moisture was. And the idea here is to get good agreement and to good calibration, what you want to do is you want to have as big a sample as you can. That's why we talk about 30 seconds. Okay, and then usually we recommend as well that you run, you take a big enough sample, you can run 3 tests out of it and then take the average. But let's say our online sample is 15.6. Let's say your manual sample is 16. Okay, so what's going to happen here is 16 to 15.6. We're going to adjust half the difference. So after we do this, we should see the value of 15.8. So calibration complete. And then we see that the sensor has adjusted to 15.8. Okay, so that's the basics of how calibration works. Now, there's a couple other things we're going to show you here. One is there's a trend feature. And since we just turned on the machine, we don't have a lot of information on there, but there's a moisture graph, and if you scroll here, there's a temperature graph. Okay, and there's a couple options for these, and you can access those again going through Menu, System Setup, 6853, Enter, and of course we'll go down to where it says Trend Options, Enter, and we can either have a 1 hour trend, or we can go 2 hour trend. And then you've got different ranges you can set for the axes on your graph. So for example, moisture range, let's change that to 10 to 20% as my range. So we just hit enter, and that'll change the scale. And you can do the same thing for temperature as well. So now in our trend, we can see that the range here is 20 to 10. And we've got a longer one, so less of it is showing so far because we haven't really run for that long. Okay, so those are your trend options. We've gone through calibration. A couple other things in here. We've got data history. And so you can look at 10-minute averages. If you just want to see a quick summary of what's been happening, maybe while you've been gone, you can hit this. There's a screen that'll scroll back through time at 10-minute averages. We've also got a USB access, so if you want to copy the data from your system, either the calibration or the data files, to a USB and then load them into your spreadsheet program, it's very easy to do. There's a USB port right on the bottom of the unit. You just plug it right in. Okay, so that's how you get access to the information. Now, there's one other part we should go through. So if you have a network and you'd like to view the Moisture Monitor Pro on your phone from your network, we can go into the system settings, and there's more information in the manual. You just go into Appendix 1, which is basically how to set it up. But where you do it is here under Network Settings, and you would enter the relevant information there under Network Settings. Okay. It's very useful. For example, you can see the graphing is probably a little more detailed on your phone, and all the information is there. You get the history and everything on your phone, so you don't have to actually be at the unit to see how things are going. Okay, there's one last thing I want to talk about, and that's, I said before at the very beginning that each product is set up a little bit differently. And it's kind of important to understand how each product, the settings for each product are important. So there's a couple of key parameters that we set up. And it has to do with basically how the sensor reads moisture. Different products of different densities require different parameters. What does that mean? It means basically we're getting a voltage back from the sensor. And if a product is very low density, we have to use a bigger multiplier on that voltage. So something like oats or sunflower is lower density, so we're going to use a bigger multiplier. Something like corn or wheat, which are heavier, would use a lower multiplier. Now we have a schedule in the manual with some suggested multiplier values. We call it, the multiplier we call a slope. I just want to show you very quickly, most times you will not have to adjust this. There are just some default values in there. But this is one thing you might want to look at if you are seeing the sensor having any problem with calibration. Okay, so the way to do this is really quite straightforward. Menu, System Setup, Password, and it's under Product Settings. And we're going to, for example, corn. So the value we're talking about here is the corn slope 1 slope sensor 1, corn slope sensor 2. We use 5 there, and that's pretty much a standard application for 56-pound corn. And so typically you won't have to change that, but there may be a point where you may want to change that if you're seeing some issues with calibration. You can always call us again at the support center at any time if you have questions about that. We can also look at your cal files that you can download to your USB if you have any questions. Now, typically you shouldn't have any problems, but this is there as an option to make adjustments if we need to make them. Okay, and so that's basically a summary of all the main features and the operational requirements for running the Moisture Monitor Pro. Again, if you have questions, there's a lot more information in the product manual, or you can call us at 1-888-318-0009, and that's at the Dryer Master Support Center.